Sometimes it takes a while to get an answer to a question, maybe even a long while, a long time, maybe even like hundreds of years, if not longer. In the very beginning of the book of Genesis, in the 4th chapter to be precise, we read the story of the very first family, and we read about what happens to the very first children born to those parents. The parents, of course, are Adam and Eve, and the children are Cain and Abel. And it quickly goes downhill as we read about the story of the first homicide in the Bible, actually fratricide, because Cain kills his brother Abel. And it's significant that we do not know the motive for the act. It's left open and unresolved, either because it thereby allows for speculation or because what prompted Cain to kill his brother really is not important. The message, perhaps, of the absence of a cause or of a motive is simply nothing can justify murder. Now, also lost to us is what they said to each other when they went out together to the field just before the crime was committed. There's an ellipsis. If the Torah had punctuation, there would be 3 dots after the words, Vayomer Cain el Havel, and Cain said to Abel, because there's no dialogue. There's no words. In other words, it's like putting a comma and parenthesis and quotation marks, and then it's blank. No words follow that introduction of the speech. So we do not know what was exchanged. For the very next words in the same sentence tell us, after it says that Cain said to Abel, it tells us then, shifting to the third person, that Cain rose up and he killed his brother Abel. Again, we may guess what led Cain to kill his brother Abel, but the Bible does not provide a clear-cut answer. In fact, some believe that the enmity between the two brothers was ingrained. It may have been deep-seated. It may have extended over a long period of time. There's an old joke that asks, how long did Cain hate his brother? And the answer, as long as he was able. Too soon? Is that? Anyway. Immediately after the murder, God asks Cain, where is Cain, your brother? And he replies, Lo yadati, I do not know. And then he says the question, Hashomer achi anochi, am I my brother's keeper? Now some may translate that phrase as, Lo yadati hashomer achi anochi, I did not know that I am my brother's keeper. But in reality, it's the question. And God responds with a strong and immediate punishment and a condemnation. But at the end of the day, the question that Cain asked in the opening chapters of the story of the human race, Hashomer achi anochi, am I my brother's keeper, is actually not directly answered by God. It's not answered until this week's Torah reading, Leviticus chapter 19 in the book of Leviticus. Among the many prescriptions given in the litany that constitutes what we refer to as Kedoshim, the holiness code, are the words where we're told both what to do and what not to do. Al ta'amod dam achicha. You shall not stand idly by the blood of your brother. First of all, it emphasizes the word brother, and therefore we know this is the answer to Cain's question. All of these chapters, all of these books later. And one of the ways we know that this is a direct response to Cain's question from the book of Genesis is because right after he killed his brother, God says to Cain, what have you done? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground, and therefore now we are told, you shall not stand idly by the blood of your brother. The question posed in the book of Genesis and the answer provided in the book of Leviticus are connected. And so sometimes, as I stated at the very outset, we have to wait a long time to get an answer to a question. And the answer, though, is unequivocal. God and the Torah want to make it crystal clear that we do have an obligation, we do have a responsibility towards other human beings. No person is an island unto themselves. We should not live our lives cut off from one another. The Midrash explains that this means we should not just go about our business. For example, if we happen to see a person drowning, we have that requirement to go and save that person. Others expand on the moral instruction and imperative mandated by the Torah in this verse to mean that we must care for others and that we cannot ignore the suffering of others. And in many respects, I would contend and suggest that the entire Torah is an answer to Cain's question, Hashomer achi anochi, am I my brother's keeper? And the answer is a resolute, resounding yes, we are our brother's keeper. This is the underlying fundamental message of the Torah, indeed, of all of Judaism. As Hillel might say, but he said it about a different verse, all the rest is commentary. Go and learn it and practice it. This approach offers us a way to live our lives. It offers us to create a world based upon kindness, upon God's desired goal for us to strive to become holy. This approach towards others is also evident in another famous, well-known verse from this week's Torah reading. Samara referred to it and taught us about it. And that was, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Va'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Now I want to comment not on those words, but actually about the first part of the verse, which is less well known. What we call the Resha, the first part. And it states, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against members of your people. Thereby raising the question, what's the difference between a grudge and vengeance? Well, based on commentaries and interpretations in Sifra, the Midrash, and Yoma from the Talmud, Rashi explains the following, quote, he says, if a person says to another, lend me your sickle, and that person says no, and then the next day, that guy who asked the first one is told, lend me your hatchet, and that guy then, who didn't get the sickle the previous day, says, I'm not going to lend it to you, because just as you refused to lend me your sickle, so now I'm not going to do this favor for you. Rashi says that is what vengeance is. So what then is the meaning of a grudge, which is in the same verse? Well, that would be if one person says to another, lend me your hatchet. The guy says no. The next day, that guy comes and asks the first guy, lend me your sickle. And the guy says, sure, I'll lend it to you. Even though I'm not like you, who yesterday wouldn't lend me a hatchet when I asked you for it. So he's doing it, he's lending it to the guy, but he's doing it, we say, with a grudge. And that explains the meaning of bearing a grudge. Because even though he doesn't actually commit vengeance by not lending it to the guy or taking revenge on the guy, he nevertheless has enmity in his heart, resentment. And even as he's saying that and giving it to him, he still is kind of digging in a little bit. Has everybody got the difference there? It's very subtle. Now, it just so happens, my son Noam, who's returning from Israel tomorrow, sent me a message just before Shabbat about the kind of thing which can only happen in Israel, and which is one of the best examples of the concepts introduced in this week's Torah portion, about lending something to another person in need. And again, it's the kind of thing that can only happen in Israel. By way of background, I'm sure you've all seen the massive weekly protest and have heard about what's going on in Tel Aviv every Saturday night, the last number of weeks, against the proposed reform of the judicial system in Israel. By the way, on Saturday, May 13th, after Shabbat morning services, Ido, our Shaliach, and I will be talking in the chapel about all that's going on, and we welcome it as an open conversation. So anyway, up until now, one of the primary images of those protests has been the massive preponderance of the flag of Israel. I'm sure you've all seen that. Proudly displayed and hoisted and carried and sometimes even worn and sometimes waved by those who are protesting. These are all the people who have been protesting. Now, those who are in the favor of the reform have not demonstrated and have not gone out to the streets until this past week. Earlier this week, those who were in favor of the government's proposed judicial reforms held a massive rally in Jerusalem, which also drew an equally impressive turnout of several 100,000 people. So here's the story. There's a guy in a WhatsApp group who happened to write and ask if anyone had an Israeli flag they could lend him to use at the demonstration in Jerusalem which was taking place in favor of the reform. And someone in the group responded and had said to him, "Sure, no problem." And here I'm quoting, "Happy to lend it to you, but you have to be sure to return it to me before Shabbat because I need it for the protest on Saturday night against the reform in Tel Aviv." Only in Israel. It's the meaning of not having a grudge. It's the meaning of not bearing vengeance. It's the meaning of lending one to another, even when you may disagree with that person. And so in this, I can't help but see a hopeful message that in the end, hopefully we, and especially the people of Israel, will realize that we are all brothers and that what unites us is actually greater than what divides and separates us. For in the end, in answer to the question asked by Cain all those years ago, yes, we are our brother's keepers. Let us keep that in mind and let us say amen.